They say that time heals all wounds. I have found, in my long passage through this world, that this is not entirely true. Time often merely sutures the surface, leaving the deeper lacerations to fester, turning a quick, angry pain into a slow, grinding ache. But what time can do, with patience, with unwavering focus, is transform that festering wound into a cold, hard resolve. It can take the raw, burning humiliation of betrayal and transmute it into an ironclad determination, honed and sharpened over years, ready to carve out a justice that is both absolute and, in its deliberate precision, truly exquisite. This is not a story of sudden vengeance, nor of fiery passion. It is a chronicle of icy patience, of silent observation, of the methodical dismantling of an arrogant fool who believed their fleeting victory was a permanent triumph. It is the narrative of how a quiet man, once deemed insignificant, can, given enough time and sufficient motive, wield the unseen levers of wealth and law to bring an empire of lies crashing down, not with a roar, but with a whisper. My journey began in the comforting embrace of Company A place where I spent nearly a decade of my early professional life. It was a small operation, a close-knit team of 10, dedicated to bespoke commissioned work for businesses scattered across our city. The owner, a man I will call Arthur, was more than just a boss. He was a patriarch. He understood the sweat equity we poured into our projects, the late nights stretching into 60-hour weeks. He reciprocated with a generosity that felt almost familial, above-market pay, performance bonuses, and a remarkable array of perks negotiated directly with our clients. I remember vividly the week he closed the entire company, paid us all, so we could attend his son's wedding, a gesture that etched itself into our collective loyalty. We had our disagreements, certainly, the occasional family squabble, but through it all, there was an unspoken covenant of respect and mutual support. Arthur, I want to be clear, never, not once, betrayed that trust. My ambition, nascent then but steadily growing, led me to the manager position when it eventually opened. I was among the most senior members of the team, deeply embedded in the company's DNA, intimately familiar with every facet of its operations. I applied, as did a few others. But the role, as Arthur explained, demanded a particular credential I lacked, a business administration degree. The position ultimately went to another colleague, someone with less practical experience at Company A, perhaps, but with that specific academic qualification. It was a moment of profound realization for me. My hands-on expertise, while invaluable, was not enough for the next rung. If I truly wanted to ascend, to shape my own destiny, I needed to broaden my intellectual horizons. I needed a degree. The decision was not made lightly. I weighed the commitment, the years of study, the financial implications. But the desire for growth, the quiet understanding that I deserved more, ultimately swayed me. I approached Arthur, my heart heavy with a mix of gratitude and the anticipation of an uncertain future, and tendered my 2 weeks' notice. I explained my aspirations, my vision for self-improvement, and he, with the wisdom of a true mentor, understood. He offered his full support, a warm handshake, and a promise that the door, if ever I chose to knock again, would always be open. This seemingly minor pivot in my life, this conscious decision to invest in myself, would, unbeknownst to me then, become a critical fuse in the long, slow-burning explosion that was to come. My university years were a delicate balancing act. Government grants covered tuition, a welcome relief, but living expenses, rent, food, the countless incidentals of daily life, remained my responsibility. So I sought employment, finding it at Company B, a sprawling retail establishment. It was a stark contrast to the intimate environment of Company A. Company B was a behemoth, 50 employees strong, yet plagued by a dizzying turnover rate. Its sheer size and constant flux created an atmosphere of organized chaos, a stark departure from Arthur's carefully cultivated family ethos. They dealt in everything from mundane groceries to astonishingly expensive, niche luxury items, catering to a specific, high-end clientele who expected discretion and efficiency. I began in the warehouse, a bustling artery of the operation, working part-time. My immediate superior was the warehouse supervisor, who, in turn, reported to the overarching store manager. Other supervisors presided over different departments, sales, customer service, merchandising, but only the sales supervisor, a position that would later be occupied by a venomous figure named Eleanor Vance, would become directly relevant to the dark turn my life was about to take. For 7 years, I dedicated myself to Company B. I devoured the knowledge of its systems, its inventory, its logistical flow. I moved from part-time to full-time, then, finally, applied for the warehouse supervisor position. I interviewed, I demonstrated my comprehensive understanding, and I secured the role. I had been supervising for several months when the manager and I, together, brought on a new warehouse clerk. Her name was Kay. Kay, though a subordinate, possessed a quiet strength and an innate sense of justice that would, in time, prove instrumental in the unfolding drama. Then came Eleanor. Eleanor Vance. Her arrival was like a shadow stretching across the sun, subtle at first, then growing to eclipse everything. She began as a cashier, a role that belied her true ambition and her astonishing ability to manipulate. She ascended the ranks with a disturbing swiftness, leaving a trail of fawning colleagues and an increasingly infatuated store manager in her wake. When a sales representative went on maternity leave, Eleanor pounced. She seized the opportunity, embedding herself in the sales team, and within a remarkably short period, she had cemented her position, not just as a permanent fixture, but as the sales supervisor. The irony of her meteoric rise, powered by charm and deceit, while my own had been built on years of diligent effort and academic pursuit, was not lost on me, even then. From the moment Eleanor Vance assumed her supervisory role, our professional relationship, if one could even call it that, became an exercise in perpetual friction. We were, as the old saying goes, oil and water. Our personalities clashed, our work ethics diverged, and our approaches to problem-solving were diametrically opposed. My method was rooted in logic, in established procedure, in quiet efficiency. Eleanor's was a masterclass in theatrics, in superficial charm, and in the art of deflective blame. She reveled in microaggressions, in the subtle undermining of my authority. She would meticulously document every minor oversight she perceived on my part, every trivial deviation from protocol, and relay it, with dramatic flair, to the manager. Yet, if I dared to highlight a legitimate issue stemming from her department, an error of her making, I was branded a snitch, accused of pettiness and insubordination. She badmouthed me and my dedicated warehouse staff openly, her voice carrying across the warehouse floor, dripping with disdain. She would interrupt me in meetings, talking over my carefully articulated points, then, moments later, brazenly rephrase my ideas, claiming them as her own. Her animosity was a constant, low-grade hum of irritation in my daily work life. She made it abundantly clear, through whispered conversations with other employees, through pointed glances and dismissive gestures, that she wished I was gone. And always, she was never at fault. The customer was mistaken, the delivery driver was incompetent, another coworker was negligent, or, most frequently, the entire predicament was my fault. There were rare instances, fleeting moments, when a fragile truce would settle between us, usually born of necessity or a momentary shared interest, but these were few and far between, quickly dissolved by her insatiable need for control and validation. The air around her vibrated with an entitlement so profound, so absolute, that it distorted the reality of everyone within her orbit. I felt it, Kay felt it, and even the manager, blinded by her flattery, felt it, though he would never admit it. Then came the day that would mark the true beginning of this chilling tale of injustice and methodical retribution. It started like any other, the rhythmic drone of forklifts, the scent of cardboard and dust mingling in the cavernous warehouse. But then, a package arrived, inconspicuous in its plain brown wrapping, yet containing an item of such exquisite value that its very presence seemed to hum with an almost ethereal energy. It was a ring set, a truly magnificent piece, custom-ordered for one of Company B's most discerning clients. Its price tag, I would later discover, hovered well north of $5,000, a sum that elevated it from mere merchandise to a tangible representation of trust and profound responsibility. Years prior, recognizing the inherent vulnerability of such precious items, I had meticulously developed a multi-step procedure for handling all jewelry, a protocol designed to mitigate any risk of loss or theft. Each step was a safeguard, a layer of protection against human error or malevolent intent. The final, critical stage involved a secure transfer. Once the item had been logged, inspected, and documented in the warehouse, it was to be immediately transported to the main office and placed directly into the store's formidable safe. On this particular day, it was I who received the ring set, its weight surprisingly substantial in the palm of my hand. I followed every step of my established procedure with the customary precision, my movements automatic, ingrained from years of diligent practice. When all the preliminary checks were complete, I informed Kay, my reliable warehouse clerk, that I was taking the package to the office for safekeeping. In the office, the only person available who possessed the combination to the main safe was Eleanor Vance. My stomach tightened. We had just endured one of our most vitriolic spats earlier that day, a heated exchange over an inventory discrepancy that, predictably, she had tried to pin on my team. The last thing I wanted was to be in her immediate vicinity, to engage with her condescending smirk or her thinly veiled hostility. But duty called. I approached her desk, the small, nondescript jewelry box held carefully in my hand. "Eleanor," I began, my voice even. "Can you open the safe for me? This needs to go in immediately." She looked up from her computer screen, her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, sweeping over me, then lingering for a fraction of a second on the innocuous box. A flicker of something, a barely perceptible shift in her expression, registered. It was a moment I would replay countless times in the months and years to come, dissecting every nuance. "Put it down here on my desk," she finally said, her tone dismissive, her gaze already returning to her screen. "I'll put it away once I'm done this email." I hesitated. My procedure dictated direct placement, but the tension between us was palpable, a thick, suffocating cloud. I weighed the options: challenge her, insist, prolong the uncomfortable encounter, or simply comply with her directive. My aversion to her proximity, my weariness from our earlier conflict, tipped the scales. I placed the box carefully on a cleared corner of her desk, directly within her reach. Then, with a sigh of internal resignation, I turned and walked away, back to the relative sanity of the warehouse. I did not linger. I did not watch her. I did not see her actually pick up the box, nor did I witness her placing it into the safe. That failure, that single-minute deviation from my own strict internal protocol, born of a desperate desire to avoid Eleanor Vance, would become the fulcrum upon which my entire professional life was, temporarily, to be overturned. The next morning, the summons came. A terse, unadorned phone call from the manager. My office. Now, a cold dread settled in my stomach. The manager's office was not a place for casual conversation. As I walked the familiar route, a knot of unease tightened in my chest. Stepping inside, the scene instantly amplified my apprehension. The manager sat behind his large mahogany desk, his expression grave. Beside him, radiating an unsettling calm, sat Eleanor Vance, her posture impeccably straight, her hands folded neatly. And then, there was the third figure, a woman I recognized instantly as the company's HR consultant, a stoic, unsmiling presence wielded only when real shit hits the fan. The air in the room was thick with unspoken accusation, a palpable weight that pressed down on me. "The ring's set," the manager began, his voice low, almost a rumble. "It's disappeared." My mind raced. The ring's set. The one I had handled yesterday. The one I had left with Eleanor. I recounted the procedure, every meticulous step, up to the point where I had delivered the box to Eleanor's desk. "The last I saw it, manager," I stated, my voice steady despite the tremor of fear growing within me, "was with Eleanor. I asked her to put it in the safe." Eleanor, without missing a beat, responded, her voice a picture of composed professionalism. "I checked the box, manager. It was empty." She then, with an almost theatrical flourish, produced the very jewelry box from beneath her desk. My eyes instantly locked onto it. It was indeed empty. The small, velvet-lined interior gaped open, a void where thousands of dollars worth of exquisite craftsmanship should have been. "I swear, manager," I insisted, my voice rising in urgency, a desperate plea against the rising tide of doubt. The rings were inside when I checked them. I checked them right before I gave the box to Eleanor. But in that stark, sterile room, with the HR consultant observing with dispassionate eyes, it was my word against hers. And then, a brutal stroke of ill fortune was revealed. The in-store video recorder broke down days before the incident. The manager explained, his words echoing with a crushing finality. There's no way to verify what happened. The crucial, objective witness, the silent eye of the camera, was blind. It was in that pregnant silence, that vacuum of proof, that Eleanor delivered the kill shot. It was his fault, manager, she stated, her voice devoid of emotion, her eyes, however, flashing with a chilling triumph as they briefly met mine. The rings were last seen in his hands. The manager turned to me, his brow furrowed with a question I already knew the answer to. Was it true? Was I, indeed, the last one to physically handle the ring box with its contents confirmed? The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. Yes, I had checked them. I had placed the box on her desk. I had walked away. I had never actually seen her pick it up, never seen her confirm its contents. Eleanor's gaze held mine, a silent, venomous gotcha dancing in her eyes. The trap, so carefully laid, so perfectly sprung, closed around me. The manager and the HR consultant, their faces impassive, asked us both to leave the office. The waiting room felt like an interrogation chamber, the minutes stretching into an eternity of agonizing uncertainty. Finally, after what felt like an age, I was called back in. The manager's voice, when he spoke, was devoid of its usual warmth. It was clipped, formal, the voice of an executive delivering an unavoidable verdict. Given your responsibility for the rings at the time they went missing, he began, and the absence of any other verifiable explanation, we are forced to conclude that you are accountable for their loss. We are terminating your employment, effective immediately. He then added, a chilling afterthought that underscored the gravity of the situation. However, as there is no definitive proof that you stole the rings, we will not be pressing charges. The relief that washed over me, a nauseating mix of fear and release, was momentary, quickly subsumed by the crushing weight of the injustice. They had thought I was a thief. They were letting me go, but the stain, the implication, was indelible. I returned to the warehouse, a shell of the man who had walked out of it mere hours before. I told Kay and the other clerks what had transpired, my voice hollow, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Their faces, a mixture of disbelief and quiet fury, reflected the outrage I felt. I gathered my personal belongings, the accumulated artifacts of years of dedication, packed them into a solitary box, and walked out of Company B for the last time. The heavy clang of the warehouse door shutting behind me echoed like the final stroke of a death knell, a stark demarcation between the life I had known and the uncertain, ignominious future that lay ahead. The initial weeks post-firing were a blur of shock and humiliation. My professional reputation, meticulously built over a decade and a half, felt utterly shattered. The injustice of it all gnawed at me, a relentless, burning ember in my gut. I wrestled with the raw anger, the sense of betrayal, the quiet fear that this incident would forever brand me, rendering me unemployable. I knew I needed to find work, any work, to simply survive, but the prospect of seeking a new position, knowing that Company B would undoubtedly offer a guarded, if not outright negative, reference, filled me with a deep despair. I imagined myself relegated to menial tasks, flipping burgers, a grim prospect for someone who had once managed a team and overseen complex logistics. In this vortex of uncertainty, a faint glimmer of hope, a desperate lifeline, presented itself. I remembered Arthur, the owner of Company A, his parting words, his promise that the door would always be open. I decided to call him, not with any real expectation, but simply to seek a positive reference, to perhaps salvage a shred of my credibility. I steeled myself for the conversation, prepared to explain the circumstances of my departure from Company B, bracing for the inevitable judgment. What transpired next was a profound, life-altering shock. Arthur listened patiently, his voice laced with concern as I recounted the terse, unjust termination. When I finished, a long silence hung in the air. Then, he spoke, his words delivered with a deliberate cadence that suggested an underlying significance. Funny you should call now, he began. My current manager, the fellow who took the position you were interested in all those years ago, he's retiring soon. Complicated health reasons. The position is about to open up. My breath caught in my throat. It was a golden opportunity, a twist of fate so profound it bordered on the miraculous. Arthur, it turned out, had quietly kept tabs on my progress during my university years, always following my trajectory with a paternal interest. He understood why I hadn't immediately returned to Company A after graduation. He respected my ambition to forge my own path. But now, with a manager role available, a role I was now eminently qualified for with my degree and expanded experience, he wanted me back. The offer was a balm to my raw, wounded spirit. It was vindication, an unexpected resurrection of my professional life. I didn't hesitate. I accepted. I plunged into my new role at Company A with a renewed vigor, a quiet determination to excel. The familiar rhythms of the business, the camaraderie of the team, Arthur's unwavering support. It was a homecoming for my soul. I threw myself into the work, the complex projects, the nuanced client relationships, finding a deep satisfaction in the challenges. For a time, I genuinely believed that the nightmare of Company B, the sting of Eleanor Vance's betrayal, was behind me. I imagined it receding into the distant past, a bitter lesson learned, a scar that would eventually fade. I was wrong. It was not behind me. It was, instead, simply dormant, waiting for the precise, opportune moment to reemerge, not to inflict further pain, but to pay dividends, to unleash a long-simmering retribution that would be both legal and financial, devastating and absolute. While I was rebuilding my life, unaware of the deeper currents at play, Kay, my loyal warehouse clerk, was executing a plan of her own. Her resolve, born of a quiet outrage, was every bit as potent as my own, though it manifested in a far more insidious, more dangerous form. Kay, a woman of sharp intuition and an unwavering moral compass, knew in her heart that I was incapable of theft. She knew the rings had been present when I handed the box to Eleanor. But she also understood the chilling calculus of Eleanor Vance's manipulation. Without irrefutable proof, Eleanor would simply deny everything, spinning the narrative to her advantage, and then, inevitably, Kay herself would become Eleanor's next target. Kay, after agonizing discussions with her husband, whom I will call Michael, hatched a plan. It was a plan that required extraordinary patience, an unsettling level of deception, and an iron will. It was a slow-burn strategy, a silent gathering of evidence, designed to ensnare Eleanor in a web of her own making. Kay began her mission with meticulous care, adopting a persona that was utterly at odds with her true feelings. She started to seek out Eleanor, to engage her in casual conversations, gradually cultivating an artificial camaraderie. Her dialogue, initially cautious, became increasingly audacious. "I'm so glad he's gone," she would exclaim, feigning relief, her voice laced with a performative exasperation. "Wish he had been fired much earlier." These were calculated barbs, carefully selected to appeal to Eleanor's inflated ego, to reinforce her manufactured triumph. Eleanor, basking in the glow of my recent professional demise, oblivious to the insidious nature of Kay's overtures, eagerly absorbed these false affirmations. She saw Kay as an ally, a kindred spirit, another person who understood the incompetence of her predecessor. Within weeks, Eleanor, emboldened by Kay's apparent loyalty and her own sense of unassailable victory, extended an invitation. Kay and Michael were to join her and her husband, whom I will call Harrison, for drinks at her home. This was a critical juncture, a deeper penetration into Eleanor's inner sanctum. Kay accepted, knowing that proximity was key. Months stretched into a year, then beyond. Kay and Michael became regular fixtures in Eleanor and Harrison's social circle. They attended weekend drinking parties, went out for couple-related events, shared meals, and exchanged confidences, all under the guise of genuine friendship. During these manufactured social engagements, Kay would, at carefully chosen intervals, continue her performance. She would casually badmouth me, her criticisms growing bolder, her feigned indignation more convincing. And Eleanor, predictable in her arrogance, would readily agree, her eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction. Kay watched. She listened. She absorbed every detail of Eleanor's life, every casual boast, every unguarded comment, meticulously filing it away. The silent gathering was underway, layer by excruciating layer. Then, after more than a year of this elaborate charade, a year of Kay suppressing her true feelings, of enduring Eleanor's self-congratulatory narratives, the moment arrived. They were at Eleanor's house, one of their regular drinking parties. The alcohol flowed freely, loosening tongues, blurring the edges of caution. Kay, as she had done countless times before, casually steered the conversation towards me, mentioning the infamous rings in passing, a carefully planted seed. And Eleanor, her inhibitions significantly lowered by the evening's consumption, delivered the words Kay had been patiently, strategically waiting for. "I wanted those rings," Eleanor slurred, a triumphant grin spreading across her face. "So I stole them." A cold tremor ran through Kay, a mixture of horror and profound vindication. This was it, the confession. Her heart pounded, but she maintained her composure, her face a mask of feigned curiosity. "Tell me more," Kay urged, her voice carefully neutral, subtly encouraging, hungry for details. Michael, seated beside her, made a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand, a silent signal that he had activated his phone, discreetly recording every word. Eleanor, too drunk to notice, too puffed up by her own perceived cleverness, continued to elaborate, oblivious to the digital ear capturing her every damning word. She recounted the events of that day with a chilling precision, her voice thick with self-admiration. She had indeed stopped writing her email. She had intended to put the rings in the safe. The safe had been open. But then, as she stood there, the jewelry box in her hand, an idea, a truly malicious spark, had ignited in her mind. She wanted me gone. She wanted those rings. And she knew, with a predatory certainty, that the cameras were conveniently broken. The confluence of these factors had presented an irresistible opportunity. She had simply pocketed the rings, closed the empty box, and then, with calculated innocence, spun the narrative so that I would bear the full weight of the blame. She described the look on my face, the dawning realization of the trap, with a chilling relish. "Where are they now?" Kay asked, her voice hushed, every nerve ending tingling. Eleanor, too far gone in her self-congratulatory revelry to see any reason for caution, not only told them, but insisted on showing them. She led Kay and Michael to her bedroom, pulling back a loose floorboard beneath her bed. There, nestled within a small, velvet pouch, were the rings. The very rings that had cost me my job, that had cast a shadow over my professional integrity, now gleamed mockingly in the dim light of Eleanor's bedroom. Michael, his hand still subtly positioned, continued to record. The entire confession, the smug detailing of her crime, the physical evidence of her guilt, all captured, preserved, immutable. The very next workday, Kay walked into Company B's manager's office. Her expression was calm, resolute. She handed him a small USB drive. "You need to hear this, manager," she said, her voice devoid of its usual deference. The manager, initially perplexed, listened. As Eleanor's slurred confession filled the sterile office, detailing her theft and her deliberate frame-up, his face drained of all color. Disbelief slowly contorted into a furious realization. The recording, irrefutable and damning, left no room for doubt. The police were called immediately. Eleanor Vance was arrested at Company B, her hubris collapsing around her like a house of cards. A search warrant was swiftly executed at her home. The rings were found, precisely where she had shown them to Kay and Michael, beneath the loose floorboard in her bedroom. Kay and Michael provided the recording, their detailed testimonies, and the physical evidence. Eleanor Vance's reckoning had begun. The silent gathering had yielded its harvest. I received the call from the prosecutor's office several weeks later. The voice on the other end was formal, precise, outlining the charges against Eleanor Vance. Theft over $5,000, among other felony counts. He explained the damning evidence, the recording, Kay and Michael's testimony, the recovery of the stolen rings. And then came the request. He wanted me to testify about what Eleanor had done to me, to paint a complete picture of her malice and manipulation. I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, the single word ringing with a quiet, profound certainty. The slow burn, the long winter of injustice, was finally giving way to the thaw of retribution. The trial, when it finally arrived, was a meticulously orchestrated drama of truth versus deceit. The courtroom was a somber arena, filled with the hushed anticipation of justice being rendered. Eleanor Vance sat at the defense table, a pale shadow of her former arrogant self, her meticulously coiffed hair and expensive suit unable to mask the fear in her eyes. The prosecutor, a sharp, methodical man, presented an airtight case. I was called to the stand first, recounting, with dispassionate clarity, the events leading up to my unjust termination. The meticulous procedure, the delivery of the box to Eleanor, her dismissive instruction, my departure, and the subsequent devastating confrontation. My voice remained even, devoid of overt emotion, allowing the facts to speak for themselves, painting a picture of Eleanor's calculated malice. Then came Kay. She testified with a quiet, unwavering conviction, detailing the elaborate charade she had maintained for over a year, the careful cultivation of Eleanor's trust, the agonizing masquerade of friendship. She described the drinking party, the conversation, the precise moment Eleanor, fueled by alcohol and hubris, had confessed. Then, the most damning piece of evidence was presented, the recording. The courtroom fell silent as Eleanor Vance's own voice, slurred but unmistakable, filled the air, describing, with chilling detail, how she had stolen the rings and meticulously framed me. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Michael followed, corroborating Kay's testimony, describing his role in discreetly capturing the confession, and then, the final, visceral punch, Eleanor's proud display of the hidden rings in her bedroom. The defense attorney, a slick, aggressive man, tried desperately to discredit Kay's testimony, arguing that she had deliberately intoxicated Eleanor, that the confession was coerced. But the judge, a woman of formidable intellect and an unimpeachable reputation, was unswayed. Evidence of Eleanor's habitual heavy drinking was readily available, rendering the defense's argument moot. The judge delivered her verdict with a stern, unyielding finality: guilty. She sentenced Eleanor Vance to 5 years in prison. Eleanor erupted, a primal scream of outrage, protesting the unfairness of it all. I, however, sitting in the public gallery, felt a quiet, profound satisfaction. 5 years. It was a tangible measure of justice, a stark reminder that even the most cunning manipulation could not withstand the relentless pursuit of truth. But for me, it was merely the first act. Even as the criminal trial unfolded, I was already engaged in the second, equally important, front of my retribution. I had, in the immediate aftermath of Eleanor's arrest, sought the counsel of a shrewd, tenacious civil attorney. We were building a case, not just for the emotional distress Eleanor had inflicted, not just for the damage to my reputation, but for the profound financial harm caused by my wrongful termination. Our initial target was Company B, for the egregious oversight and the unjust firing. But Company B, recognizing the undeniable strength of our case, the irrefutable evidence of Eleanor's guilt, and the clear violation of my employment rights, settled swiftly, almost preemptively. The day they received notice of our intent to sue, they folded, offering a substantial sum that covered my lost wages and acknowledged their culpability without the need for a protracted legal battle. They knew they would lose, and they knew the cost would be far greater in a public courtroom. Eleanor Vance, however, was not so fortunate. She attempted a desperate, transparent maneuver to shield her assets. Days after her arrest, her husband, Harrison, initiated divorce proceedings, claiming a complete dissolution of their marriage and seeking to transfer all their joint assets, their home, their savings, their investments, solely into his name. It was a cynical, poorly disguised attempt to render Eleanor judgment-proof, to ensure that any civil judgment against her would be merely symbolic. My attorney, however, was not easily fooled. He meticulously tracked the asset transfers, uncovering the blatant attempt at fraud. He swiftly moved to add Harrison Vance to the lawsuit, arguing that he was complicit in the attempt to defraud creditors and that the divorce was a sham designed solely to protect ill-gotten gains. The court, presented with the irrefutable evidence of the fraudulent transfer, agreed. Harrison Vance, drawn into the vortex of his wife's deceit, now faced the same financial ruin. Our lawsuit against Eleanor and Harrison Vance was comprehensive. We sought compensation for the back pay I had lost from the day I was fired until I rejoined Company A. We demanded damages for the profound emotional distress she had inflicted, the fear, the humiliation, the anguish of being falsely accused. And we sought reimbursement for all legal fees incurred in pursuing this justice. The combined sum we pursued was substantial, a figure that would, in its totality, utterly decimate their financial standing. The civil case moved through the discovery phase, the depositions, the pretrial hearings. Eleanor, stripped of her mask of civility, revealed a bitter, snarling individual. Harrison, a man who had passively benefited from her schemes, now faced the chilling reality of his wife's reckless actions. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Eleanor's criminal conviction, the recording, Kay and Michael's testimonies, the recovered rings, the fraudulent divorce proceedings. It was an edifice of guilt that no legal machinations could dismantle. Faced with inevitable defeat and the prospect of a public trial that would lay bare their deceit, they too, eventually, settled. But unlike Company B's quick, pragmatic settlement, Eleanor and Harrison's was a capitulation, a surrender forced by the crushing weight of their culpability and the looming threat of complete financial annihilation. They lost their home, a significant portion of their savings, and suffered irreparable damage to their credit and reputations. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had once reveled in her perceived power, was now financially ruined, stripped of her material possessions, and facing years of incarceration. The legal and financial nets had tightened, rendering her utterly powerless. And now, you might be wondering, where is the metaphoric cherry on top of this meticulously crafted revenge? Where is the final, exquisite twist, the ultimate flourish of irony that elevates mere justice to something truly unforgettable? It arrived, as these things often do, with an almost poetic serendipity, years after Eleanor Vance had disappeared behind prison bars, years after her financial world had crumbled. Life at Company A had continued its steady, prosperous course. I had fully embraced my role as manager, contributing to the company's growth, nurturing its culture, and upholding Arthur's legacy. Recently, a position had opened up in our team, a new hire needed to replace a departing colleague. Arthur, trusting my judgment implicitly, had tasked me with overseeing the initial screening of resumes and setting up interviews. It was a routine administrative task, one I performed with the methodical efficiency I had cultivated over decades. I sat at my desk, a stack of resumes before me, each representing a hopeful candidate, a potential future member of our team. I reviewed them, one by one, assessing qualifications, experience, and cultural fit. My pen moved rhythmically, making notes, flagging promising prospects. Then, a name caught my eye. A name that, even after years, still carried a faint, almost imperceptible charge. Eleanor Vance. My hand paused midair. It was her. The address matched. The employment history, though sparse, and with a significant gap, I later learned it had been almost 6 years since her last job at Company B, a gap presumably filled by her incarceration and the subsequent fallout, confirmed it. Eleanor Vance. Applying to my company. To my department. A slow smile, cold and utterly devoid of warmth, spread across my face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated anticipation. My initial instinct, a raw, primal urge, was to immediately discard the resume, to consign it to the shredder, to banish her from even the possibility of encroaching on my carefully rebuilt world. But then, a more refined, more devious thought took hold. A thought that understood the profound psychological impact of a carefully orchestrated final confrontation. This was not about revenge. It was about the public declaration of a long-overdue victory. It was about allowing her to walk into the trap of her own making one last time. I approved her for an interview. Arthur, unaware of the name's true significance, simply saw another candidate to be considered. Eleanor arrived at her slotted time, meticulously dressed, radiating an air of polished confidence, a practiced charm that I remembered all too well. She walked into the conference room, her steps brisk, her head held high, ready to brown-nose her way through yet another interview, to weave her web of superficiality and ambition. She sat down, her gaze sweeping across the room, prepared to greet her potential new manager. And then she saw me. My face, carefully composed, betrayed nothing. I simply sat there, watching her, observing the precise moment of recognition. Her eyes, initially bright with professional eagerness, suddenly widened. The color drained from her face, leaving it a stark, bloodless white. Her practiced smile faltered, her posture stiffened. The air in the room, previously neutral, crackled with an unspoken tension, a history suddenly made manifest. "Ah, Eleanor," I said, my voice low, smooth, and utterly devoid of warmth. "How are you? Remember me?" The effect was instantaneous and absolute. She froze, utterly immobilized, like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming train. The arrogance, the false charm, the carefully constructed facade, all of it crumbled in that single, shattering moment. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged. There was only a blank, deer-in-the-headlights look, a profound, speechless terror. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic thumping of my own heart, a drumbeat of finality. I picked up her resume, my gaze lingering on her name, on the gaps in her employment history, on the carefully constructed narrative of her recent past. I looked at her, truly looked at her, a woman who had once wielded such destructive power, now utterly exposed, utterly vulnerable. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," I finally said, my voice clear, precise, and imbued with an authority she could no longer deny. "I do not think you will be a good fit for our company. Thank you for applying." She said not one word. She simply rose, her movements stiff and wooden, her eyes still wide with shock and humiliation, and walked out of the room, out of the building, and out of my life forever. The door closed softly behind her, a gentle click that resonated with the finality of a perfectly executed plan. This story, like all true stories of justice, is not simply about revenge. It is about the inherent power of quiet observation, the strategic accumulation of facts, and the unwavering belief that truth, however long it takes, however circuitous its path, will ultimately prevail. Eleanor Vance believed her victory was absolute, her manipulation complete. She underestimated the loyalty of a good colleague, the meticulousness of a careful employee, and the relentless, grinding force of a man committed to seeing justice served. In the intricate dance of life, where ambition often clashes with ethics and arrogance frequently masquerades as competence, there exists a profound lesson. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Never dismiss the unassuming, for within their calm exterior often lies an intellect sharper than any blade, a resolve harder than any stone, and a patience that can outlast even the longest night. For some, justice is not a swift, fleeting moment, but a long, cold dish, seasoned with time, crafted with precision, and served, at last, with an unforgettable, chilling grace. And the satisfaction, in that moment, is absolute.